The slap of laughter echoed across the marble floor of Westbrook International Airport. Elijah Marsh sat still in his wheelchair, hands folded over an old, faded military duffel bag resting on his lap. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. He had heard that kind of laughter before, the kind that comes from people who think they will never be small, never be slow, never be forgotten. "Sir, you need to move." "Now," said Marcus Bell, the airport CEO, his voice sharp enough to cut through the noise of the terminal. Elijah lifted his eyes slowly. He was 86 years old, his skin the color of old wood polished by time, his veteran's jacket worn thin at the elbows. A small pin shaped like a pair of silver wings sat crookedly on his chest. "I'm waiting for my ride, son," Elijah said softly. "Well, wait somewhere else," Marcus snapped, gesturing toward a red carpet rolled out for a press event. "You're blocking my VIP lane." Cameras flashed. A small crowd of reporters turned to watch. Marcus smirked, playing to the audience, mocking the old man's slow hands as he tried to will himself back. What none of them knew, what Marcus Bell could not have imagined in his wildest nightmare, was that the old man he had just humiliated was the very reason this airport existed at all. And by the end of the week, that truth would burn his career to the ground. Elijah Marsh had arrived at Westbrook International 3 hours early, just like he always did. Old habits from the military never left him. Early is on time. On time is late. That was the lesson the army had carved into him 60 years ago, and even now, with his knees aching and his hands trembling slightly from age, he lived by it. He had come to pick up his granddaughter, Naomi, who was flying in from Atlanta for her college graduation party. He wanted to be there for her, wheelchair or not. He wasn't a man who let his body's limits become excuses. The terminal buzzed with life, families embracing near baggage claim, children running with toy airplanes, vendors calling out coffee orders. Elijah loved watching it all. There was something about an airport, something about people coming and going, returning to loved ones, leaving for new beginnings, that filled him with quiet joy. He had built places like this once. Not just worked in them, built them. With his hands. With blueprints he drew himself, with friendships forged in concrete dust and steel beams, with a stubborn dream that a young black engineer from a segregated town in Alabama could leave something permanent behind in a world that told him he never would. But that was a different lifetime. A different name. Nobody here knew Elijah Marsh from any other elderly man passing through security. He was invisible, and in some strange way, he had grown used to it. He didn't mind the staring children. He didn't mind being asked to move his wheelchair for a cleaning cart. What he minded, what still stung, even after all these decades, was being looked through, like he wasn't even a person standing there. Like his life, his service, his sacrifice didn't matter once his hair turned gray and his back curved with age. He gripped the worn handle of his duffel bag a little tighter and watched the gate numbers change above him. Gate 14. Almost time. He had no idea that today, of all days, his quiet world was about to collide with a man who would make him relive every ounce of disrespect he thought he'd left behind in 1962. But this time, the truth would not stay buried. Marcus Bell strode through the terminal like he owned it, because, in his mind, he did. At 34, he had become the youngest CEO in Westbrook International's history. Tall, sharply dressed, his shoes polished to mirror shine, Marcus moved with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no and meant it. He had been hired 2 years earlier by the airport's board, brought in to modernize operations, cut costs, and boost the airport's image. Today was supposed to be his crowning achievement, a press conference announcing a multi-million-dollar renovation, complete with a ribbon cutting, sponsors, local news cameras, and champagne waiting backstage. Everything had to be perfect. "Where's my red carpet team?" Marcus barked into his earpiece, marching toward Gate 14, where the press conference podium had been set up beneath gleaming new signage that read Westbrook International, a new ERA. He didn't notice Elijah at first. Not really. The old man in the wheelchair was just another obstacle, another detail standing between Marcus and his perfect photo. Marcus had built his entire career avoiding details that slowed him down. "Sir, can you move?" Marcus said, barely glancing at Elijah. Elijah, startled, looked up. "I'm sorry. You're sitting in the middle of my event." "Move," Marcus repeated, louder this time, already turning to check his reflection in the terminal glass. Elijah began to will himself slowly to the side, his hands trembling slightly with the effort. It wasn't fast enough for Marcus. "Faster, sir, please." "We don't have all day," Marcus said, rolling his eyes toward the gathering reporters, drawing a small ripple of laughter from his own staff. Something in Elijah's chest tightened, not with anger, but with a tired, familiar ache. He had felt this exact disrespect before. Decades ago. From men who wore different uniforms but carried the same arrogance. He said nothing. He simply nodded, moved his chair, and folded his hands again over his duffel bag. But Marcus wasn't finished. "What is this, like, a senior citizen convention?" Marcus muttered to an assistant, just loud enough for a few nearby travelers to hear. A reporter chuckled. Someone raised a phone, ready to record the press event. Elijah's eyes flicked toward the worn patches on his jacket sleeve, patches that told a story Marcus would never bother to ask about. A story of war. Of loss. Of building something out of nothing. He simply smiled. A calm, knowing smile. The kind that unsettles people who don't understand its source. A security guard nearby, an older black man named Walter, froze mid-step when he saw that smile. His eyes widened. He took a step closer, studying the old man's face, then the pin on his jacket. "No," Walter whispered to himself. "It can't be." But nobody heard him over the clicking cameras and Marcus's booming voice announcing the start of his press conference. Nobody yet understood that the foundation beneath their feet, literally, had been poured by the hands of the man they had just humiliated. But that was about to change. By the time Elijah's granddaughter Naomi arrived at the gate, the press conference crowd had thinned, but the sting of what happened lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. "Grandpa, are you okay?" Naomi asked, kneeling beside his wheelchair, her graduation gown still folded carefully in her carry-on bag. "I'm fine, baby," Elijah said, patting her hand. "Just a man with more title than sense." Naomi frowned. She had heard the whispers from other travelers, "Did you see how that CEO talked to him?" and her stomach turned with anger. But Elijah simply shook his head, signaling her to let it go. What neither of them noticed was Walter, the security guard, watching them from a distance, his radio crackling quietly in his hand. "Dispatch," Walter said into his radio, voice low, "I need someone to check airport records. Founding documents. Now." "Walter, it's a busy day, we don't have time for." "Just do it," Walter interrupted. "Trust me." Inside the administrative offices upstairs, an elderly records clerk named Dorothy Hayes nearly dropped her clipboard when Walter's request reached her desk. She had worked at Westbrook for over 40 years, long enough to remember stories whispered by the original construction crew, stories about a young black engineer who designed the airport's very first runway extension back in the 1960s, only to have his name erased from the official records after a political dispute with the city council. "It can't be him," Dorothy murmured, her hands trembling as she pulled out an old, yellowed folder marked "Confidential," Original Blueprints, 1961. She stared at the cover page. A name, faded but legible, was printed in the corner, E. Marsh, lead structural engineer. But what happened next shocked everyone. Word began to spread, not through any announcement, but through the quiet network of longtime airport employees who remembered fragments of a story most had assumed was just legend. A cleaning supervisor who'd heard it from her mother, who used to work in the old terminal cafeteria. A retired baggage handler who once saw an old photograph in a storage closet before it was thrown away during a renovation. A pilot who'd flown out of Westbrook for 30 years and had once asked why the cornerstone near Gate 2 had a name chiseled into it that didn't match any name in the airport's official history. The cornerstone. Nobody outside a handful of older staff even remembered it existed, buried now behind a vending machine and a faded "Welcome to Westbrook" mural. But it was still there. And it still bore 4 words that would soon shake the entire airport to its core. Founded by Elijah Marsh. However, that was only the beginning. Marcus Bell, riding high from what he believed was a flawless press conference, had no idea that a quiet storm was forming just beneath the surface of his perfect day. He sat in his glass-walled office overlooking the runways, sipping champagne with the board chairman, congratulating himself on the renovation announcement. The press loved it, Marcus said confidently. "We're going to be all over tonight's news." "We already are," the board chairman replied, frowning slightly as he scrolled through his phone. "Just maybe not for the reason you think." Marcus's smile faltered. "What do you mean?" The chairman turned his phone screen toward him. A video, shaky, clearly filmed by a bystander's phone, showed Marcus mocking Elijah in the terminal, his voice dripping with condescension, the old veteran's slow, careful movements as he tried to will himself aside. The video had been online for less than 2 hours. It already had over 500,000 views. Senior Citizen Convention, a comment read. "This man has no shame." "That's an elderly veteran," another user wrote. "Disgusting." Marcus's stomach dropped, but his pride wouldn't let him show it. "It's nothing. People will forget by tomorrow." But the chairman's expression remained grim. "Marcus, do you know who that man is?" "Some old guy in a wheelchair," Marcus said dismissively. "Why does it matter?" "Because," the chairman said slowly, "Dorothy from Records just sent me something you need to see." He placed a folder on the desk, the same folder Dorothy had pulled earlier, containing faded blueprints and an old employee badge photo. A young man, no older than 25, stared back from the black and white photograph. Tall. Proud. Wearing a hard hat and an engineer's vest, standing in front of unfinished steel beams that would one day become Westbrook International's main terminal. Marcus stared at the name beneath the photo. Elijah Marsh. He looked up slowly. That's not possible." "It's very possible," the chairman said. "And if this gets out the way I think it's about to, you're not just dealing with a bad PR moment, Marcus. You're dealing with the man who built this airport from the ground up, back when no one would even let him eat in the cafeteria he designed." Marcus's throat went dry. Nobody knew the truth yet, not even Marcus, fully. But the pieces were falling into place faster than he could control. What happened the next morning made things worse. The next morning, local news vans surrounded Westbrook International's main entrance. The video of Marcus mocking Elijah had exploded overnight, fueled by outrage from veterans organizations and civil rights groups who recognized the painful echo of history in that single, careless moment. Inside the airport, Dorothy Hayes had spent the entire night combing through old archives, pulling documents that had been buried for over 60 years. What she found stunned even her. In 1961, a young engineer named Elijah Marsh had been hired, quietly, almost secretly, by the original construction firm building Westbrook's first major runway expansion. He had graduated top of his class in civil engineering, but no major firm in the segregated South would hire him outright. Desperate for work and determined to build something meaningful, he had been brought on as a technical consultant, a title used to mask the fact that he was, in practice, the lead structural designer for the entire terminal framework. He had worked under brutal conditions, forced to enter through service doors, banned from using the same restrooms as his white colleagues, paid far less than men with half his skill. Yet his designs were so innovative, so ahead of their time, that the airport's original structure still stood as the backbone of the modern facility decades later. When the airport's expansion was completed in 1963, the city council, under political pressure, refused to publicly credit Elijah for his work. His name was scrubbed from press releases. Local newspapers credited a white project manager who had barely touched the technical designs. Elijah, devastated but unwilling to fight a battle he knew he couldn't win in that era, quietly walked away, but not before secretly having his name carved into the cornerstone, a quiet act of defiance that no one in power ever noticed. He went on to serve in the military, then spent the rest of his career as an engineering consultant, never speaking publicly about Westbrook again. Dorothy printed everything, old blueprints with his signature, his original employment contract, a faded photograph of him shaking hands with the airport's first board chairman, even a microfiche copy of a 1963 internal memo discussing how to minimize public attention on his role. She brought everything straight to the board chairman's office. "This is bigger than a viral video," she said, her voice trembling. "This is decades of buried injustice. And Marcus Bell just dragged it back into the light without even knowing it." But that was only the beginning of what the world was about to learn. By that afternoon, news outlets had picked up Dorothy's findings. Headlines spread rapidly. Airport CEO mocks war veteran who secretly built the airport he now runs. The untold story of Elijah Marsh, erased from history, now vindicated. The board, desperate to control the damage, scheduled an emergency public statement. Marcus, pale and visibly shaken, stood before the same podium where he had mocked Elijah just a day earlier. "I want to formally apologize to Mr. Marsh," Marcus said stiffly, reading from a prepared statement. "We are deeply sorry for any misunderstanding that occurred yesterday." The crowd of reporters scoffed audibly. "Misunderstanding," one shouted. "You humiliated a war hero on camera." Marcus continued, ignoring the jab. "We are pleased to announce that, moving forward, Westbrook International will recognize Mr. Marsh's historic contributions with a small plaque near the terminal entrance." For a moment, it seemed like things might smooth over. The board exhaled in relief. Dorothy, watching from the back of the room, felt a flicker of hope. Maybe justice, even decades late, was finally arriving. Naomi, sitting beside her grandfather in the front row, squeezed his hand. "Grandpa, they're going to fix this. They're finally going to recognize you." Elijah said nothing, his expression calm, unreadable. He had learned long ago not to trust promises made under pressure, made only because cameras were watching. He was right not to trust it. Because what happened next would reveal something far more disturbing than a single CEO's arrogance, a secret the airport's leadership had fought for decades to keep buried. They thought the fight was over. They were completely wrong. That evening, an investigative journalist named Renee Ortiz, who had been digging deeper into the original 1960s construction records, made a discovery that shattered the fragile peace the board had tried to create. While cross-referencing old payroll documents, Renee found something alarming: financial records showing that Elijah Marsh hadn't simply been underpaid or uncredited, he had been deliberately cheated out of patent rights for a structural support system he had personally invented, a system that had since been used in airport constructions across the entire country, generating millions of dollars in licensing fees over the decades. Worse, those patent rights had eventually been quietly transferred, through a series of corporate mergers, into the very holding company that now financially backed Westbrook International's modern operations. In other words, the company Marcus Bell worked for, the very institution under his leadership, had profited for decades off an invention stolen from a black engineer who had never been compensated or credited. Renee published her findings within hours. The story exploded far beyond the original viral video. Now it wasn't just a story about disrespecting an elderly veteran, it was a story about systemic theft, buried corporate corruption, and a decades-long cover-up. The board chairman called an emergency meeting that night, panic written across every face in the room. "This isn't just bad PR anymore," the chairman said grimly. "This is a legal nightmare. If Marsh decides to pursue this, and frankly, he'd be right to, we're looking at lawsuits, federal investigations, maybe criminal charges against people who made decisions decades before any of us were even born." Marcus sat at the end of the table, his hands shaking. The polished, confident CEO from yesterday's press conference had vanished, replaced by a man suddenly aware that his arrogance had unearthed something far bigger than himself. "What do we do?" Marcus asked quietly. "We pray," the chairman said, "that Elijah Marsh is a more forgiving man than you deserve." The real secret had not been revealed yet. And it would change everything. The next morning, Walter, the security guard who had first recognized Elijah, was asked to escort him into the boardroom for what the airport's leadership hoped would be a private, controlled conversation. But as Elijah was wheeled down the long executive hallway, something unexpected happened. An elderly woman, leaning heavily on a cane, stepped out of a side office. Her hair was silver, her eyes sharp despite her age. She looked at Elijah, and for a long moment, neither of them said a word. "Elijah Marsh," she finally whispered. "After all these years." Elijah studied her face carefully, then his eyes widened. "Margaret? Margaret Sinclair?" She nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "I never forgot you. I was the secretary who typed up your original contracts back in '61. I always wondered what happened to you after they pushed you out." Margaret revealed something that stunned everyone in the hallway, including Walter and the board members who had gathered nearby. She had kept a personal diary from that time, decades old, hidden in a box in her attic, documenting in detail how city officials and construction executives had conspired to erase Elijah's name from the project, how they had specifically chosen to bury his structural patent under a shell company specifically to avoid paying him royalties, fearing that a black engineer holding a powerful patent would draw unwanted attention during the racially tense years of the early 1960s. She had kept the diary out of guilt for decades, never knowing what to do with it, never imagining she would have the chance to make things right. "I have it in my car," Margaret said. "I want to give it to you, Elijah. It's long overdue." The diary, combined with the financial records Renee Ortiz had already uncovered, created an undeniable, fully documented case of historical theft and discrimination, one that could no longer be dismissed as rumor or speculation. Word of Margaret's diary spread through the airport's leadership like wildfire. The board chairman, realizing the depth of exposure now facing the company, knew that quiet apologies and small plaques would never be enough to contain this. This was no longer just about Elijah Marsh's dignity. This was about confronting decades of buried injustice, in front of the entire world. 3 days later, the airport held an emergency public hearing in its largest conference hall, packed with reporters, airport employees, veterans' rights organizers, and curious travelers who had followed the story online. Cameras lined the back wall. Naomi sat beside her grandfather, holding his hand tightly. Marcus Bell stood at the podium, visibly smaller than he had appeared just days earlier. The chairman sat beside him, along with several lawyers representing the airport's parent company. Elijah Marsh was wheeled to the front of the room, his duffel bag resting on his lap as it always did. The room fell silent. "Mr. Marsh," the chairman began, his voice tight with nerves, "on behalf of Westbrook International, we want to formally and publicly apologize." "Stop," Elijah said quietly. The room froze. He looked at Marcus directly. "Son, I don't want an apology written by lawyers. I want you to look me in the eye and tell me what you saw when you looked at me in that terminal." Marcus's throat tightened. The cameras zoomed in. He glanced at his lawyers, who offered no help. "I saw." Marcus hesitated, his voice cracking slightly. "I saw an old man in my way." "That's the truth," Elijah said, nodding slowly. "At least you're honest now." He turned his gaze toward the crowd, his voice steady despite his age. "I built the bones of this airport with these hands," he said, raising them slightly. "I designed systems that are still holding up buildings across this country today. And when I tried to put my name on that work, they erased me. They told me a black man's name didn't belong on something this important." Gasps rippled through the room. "I carved my name into that cornerstone myself," Elijah continued, "late one night, when no one was watching. I didn't do it for fame. I did it because I needed to know, even if no one else ever did, that I was here. That I mattered. That this airport stands because I made sure it could. Naomi wiped tears from her eyes, gripping her grandfather's hand tighter. And then, Elijah said, his voice hardening slightly, 60 years later, a young man mocks me in front of cameras because I was too slow getting out of his way. Because to him, I was nothing but an old inconvenience. Marcus lowered his head, unable to meet Elijah's gaze. But what happened next shocked everyone watching. Elijah's expression softened. I'm not here for revenge, son. I'm too old for that. I'm here because the truth deserves to be told, finally, after all these years. Not for me, but for every person who built something great and was told they didn't matter. The room remained silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone present. That I and the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded swiftly and decisively. An independent investigation, launched under public pressure, confirmed everything Renee Ortiz and Margaret Sinclair's diary had revealed. The airport's parent company issued a formal acknowledgement of historical wrongdoing, agreeing to establish a multi-million-dollar trust fund in Elijah Marsh's name, covering decades of unpaid patent royalties, with a portion directed toward scholarships for young black engineers pursuing careers in infrastructure and design. Marcus Bell resigned from his position as CEO within the month, his statement citing personal reflection rather than admitting the full truth, but few were fooled. His public humiliation became a cautionary tale repeated in business ethics classes and corporate leadership seminars across the country, a stark reminder of how quickly arrogance can unravel when truth finally surfaces. The cornerstone near Gate 2, once hidden behind a vending machine, was excavated, restored, and placed prominently in the airport's main terminal, illuminated beneath a glass case with a plaque that finally told the full story. Elijah Marsh, engineer, veteran, founder of Westbrook International's original vision. Erased once. Remembered forever. Westbrook International hosted a formal renaming ceremony for its main terminal hall, now called the Marsh Pavilion, with Elijah, dressed proudly in his old uniform jacket, polished metals catching the light, wheeled to the center of the room as hundreds applauded. Margaret Sinclair stood quietly near the back, finally at peace after decades of guilt. Walter, the security guard who first recognized Elijah, stood near the entrance, beaming with quiet pride. Dorothy Hayes, who had risked her job pulling forgotten records, was personally thanked by Elijah himself, who took her hand and said simply, "You gave me back my name, child. I won't forget that." Naomi, watching her grandfather receive the recognition he had waited 60 years for, wept openly, overwhelmed not with sadness, but with a deep, aching pride. That evening, as the crowd slowly dispersed and the terminal lights dimmed into a soft evening glow, Elijah sat quietly near his cornerstone, his duffel bag resting on his lap as it always had. Naomi knelt beside him. "How does it feel, Grandpa? After all these years?" Elijah looked up at the gleaming terminal ceiling, the very steel beams he had once designed as a young man who wasn't even allowed to eat lunch with his own coworkers. "It feels," he said slowly, "like the world finally caught up to the truth." He reached out and gently touched the glass case protecting his name, carved decades ago in secret, in defiance, in hope. "They tried to erase me once," he said softly. "But you can't erase someone who built the foundation everyone else is standing on." Naomi smiled through her tears, resting her head against his shoulder. Outside, planes continued taking off and landing, carrying people toward new beginnings, just as they always had, built on a foundation poured by hands the world had almost forgotten. But never again. Because some truths, no matter how deeply buried, no matter how many decades pass, always find their way back into the light. And some men, no matter how small the world tries to make them feel, leave a mark that outlasts every wall built to erase them.